now it's on, Jeff.
Where did it go?
So has everyone found their way to coffee, cannoli? Conversation will be back here.
Coffee's on.
It's decaf.
Mhm.
Yes, it is.
So we're gonna stay here for the beginning and then,
I think so.
so I'll turn these lights.
I just put that, amber. I don't know.
I'm just thinking for the beginning.
Yes, it's, well, I guess not. No, we don't actually need it at all.
Right.
Whatever, ever. I can't help but note that we have a heavily emailed groupie. We're happy to have you from.
I appreciate you.
All are welcome.
Yeah, I can tell that. I've heard that, yes.
Maybe bring the cannolis in. Maybe we should bring the cannolis in.
Just waiting for almost 7 to do that, because that's when we're supposed to start in here. If anybody else comes through, they can grab it. I probably could check that if I looked at my phone.
Will you not remote people, but if you want to ask a question, they can text my number. And I will tell them mine.
Okay.
Or they can text your number.
No, I don't want to text my number. I do not.
Yes.
But I'm open. Yes, be assured, if you're off mic, sky's the limit.
The nuns in the story wouldn't have allowed that. No. Not without consequences. You get to take some home for it. Well, I need my phone. I'm not using my cell phone. For people to-
If you're really having important
I, yeah. I turned it off in the theater and I forgot to turn it back on. You need my phone number?
Jeff will have to announce it.
Okay.
So Bill, your summer is well along.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Busy, busy, busy. But that's good. So I should, see the show at the Maryville Playhouse this afternoon in Auburn. Supposed to be a 2 o'clock show. 45 minutes late. Well, there'd been an accident and some of the actors were caught in a traffic jam. And then 10 minutes before the show, the lead actress got sick and couldn't go on stage. I just thought he's ready to go. So I just made it. Huh?
Show went on.
The show went on. But it required the girl who moved up to the lead, somebody had to fill in her role, and then the person who filled that role, somebody had to fill in that role. They have legislative, which is good.
Good evening. Thank you for those that got here bright and early for Cannolis Coffee and are ready for conversation. Quickly, exits back there, over here. Restrooms in the back in the lobby, if anyone needs them. And Father Fred would not forgive me if we all didn't turn around and wave to anybody that's watching us streaming. So just what we would like to do, and the author has us going to get into a little group session after he gets us started. So when we get going, he'll get a little presentation, and then we'll invite you to all come up here, use the remaining cannolis as a little treat so that you can migrate up here quickly. So thank you on behalf of the task force for joining us this evening for our book club event featuring Sanctuaries by Vince, and I'm not going to destroy your name, and I'm going to let him get things started for us.
Do you want to say about?
Oops, wait a minute. I didn't have this written down. Those streaming, if you'd like to text any questions, comments, you can do so to the following number, 315-395-9308. Again, that's 315-395-9308. And we will attempt to get you in the mix. Thank you.
Is that your number? Oh, man.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for coming tonight. This is going to be very quick. We're basically just setting the time frame, and then we'll get into a conversation. I'm willing to answer questions, but I hope that the conversation goes beyond that. These are trying times for many of us, and I think that Sanctuaries is kind of a catalyst for us to talk about some of the things that we're going through right now as far as the question of truth. Many of us feel like we're backsliding, so let's have a conversation about that. It'll be a safe space where like-minded, caring people can talk about what you're feeling right now. So the first two slides that we're going to move to, many of you have read the book. I'm sure not all of you have read the book. I'm sure not all of you have gotten through the book. I was a teacher and I was a student before that, and I'll tell you there were many times I didn't do my homework before class started. So I won't tell anybody if you didn't read, but if you did read the book, the first two slides basically just set the stage. So here, I think you'll recognize everybody from the era, from going from the early 1960s through the early 1970s. The only person, I don't want to insult anybody, but the only person that maybe some people might not recognize.
You might acknowledge that the live streaming people cannot see that.
Right, okay. Well, so in our pictures, we have Pope John, we have President Kennedy, we have Martin Luther King, we have Malcolm X, we have Medgar Evers, who I was going to mention, and we have another Kennedy. Medgar Evers, I don't know. If some people are not familiar with him, he was also a civil rights leader who was slaughtered in his driveway in front of his home, with his wife and children there. So even though Sanctuaries is certainly fiction, it takes place in a time and involves stories and people who are very real, very, very real. And if we move on, we also know that this was the time during the Vietnam War and also the Civil Rights Movement. And again, folks who have read the book remember that all of those issues are referred to when Johnny is very young and he's watching television with his parents. And if you remember, his mother, Fina, at the time yells at the television because she can't believe that children are being hosed down with hoses that are powerful enough to rip the skin off of bodies. Could move to the next one. Now here, this I want to speak to a little more because not everybody would be as familiar. So within the context of this time, we also have what's now called the Stonewall Rebellion. And Stonewall was not the only time that there was this kind of a revolt, but it is the one that caught on and the one that most people seem to remember. And my own view of what happened with Stonewall, I mean, I'm again assuming that everybody here knows what Stonewall is, but in case there's one or two people that don't, Stonewall is usually thought of as the beginning of the modern LGBT movement, that it was after Stonewall things really started to happen. That's not so true. There was a lot going on before Stonewall, and there were a lot of similar rebellions. But the thing that I want to point out about Stonewall that I don't think is recognized a lot is that it was much more than about someone's sexual preference or gender identity. It was much more than that. I would hold Stonewall up as one of the major revolts that ever happened in this country because it was such an intersection of so many issues. It was about class. It was about poverty. It was about race. It was about the connection between organized crime and the police. Many people who went to Stonewall would not have even been allowed to go into other gay bars in the village at the time. So its significance, I think, is lost not only in the mainstream, but I would say it's even lost in LGBTQ politics, where it's not seen for all of the issues that it involved. And again, the Village Voice had most of the information on it. At the time, the Village Voice was probably maybe the only paper that actually gave information on it, but then later on it appeared in some other newspapers. We can move on. Now at that same time, could go to the next one, at the same time, you'll remember in the book where I talk about the piers at the time. So the Greenwich Village of the late 1960s, early 70s looks nothing like the Greenwich Village of today. So at that time, you're by the waterfront. Many of the piers were broken. They were run down. They were dangerous. The neighborhoods were dangerous. And it was really where the margins of the margins wound up being. And this is also what brought on Stonewall, because people were pushed into the shadows. They were pushed out of their homes, out of their churches, out of their synagogues, out of their temples, out of their cultures, out of their neighborhoods. They were pushed into the shadows. And then even in the shadows, the police were going to come in and harass because they might have gotten into some kind of a snit with organized crime. So it was like, enough already. You know, we've already been pushed into the shadows. Where are we going to be pushed into the East River? So this winds up being where we see, if you go to the village now, it looks like a park, and where the piers were, it's all green, or people go and visit, they bring picnics. At the time, it was really a gathering place where mostly gay men, some lesbians, and trans people would meet, and more than meet. It was also, it was a place of illicit sex. It was a place where people came together, where people were seen, because they weren't seen where they lived. So this is where they were seen. Okay, you can, and also a lot of culture and art came out of that area. There were paintings and murals inside some of these buildings. In fact, about a year ago, I was down there and I was walking in the new park that's there. And I don't know how I got into a conversation with this young woman, but I tend to, I could talk to a lamppost, so no matter where I am, I just start talking to somebody. And this woman turned, I think she was from Finland, or she was from or Sweden or something. And she was a student of architecture and art, and she was in the area because she wanted to learn about, well, where did the people go and how were people displaced? And she was she studied many of the artists that came out of it. So it was really an opportunity for her to meet this old gay guy that knew where the people, people that were there once upon a time. And we got into this conversation about that. This here, in the book I mentioned Kellers, where Johnny meets Gabriel. So this is what Kellers looked like. So it gives you a feeling of how seedy and dangerous, that area was. Kellers was a real bar. It was a bar that I've been to. Okay, so now we shift to the backstory. And of course, the backstory, as many of you know, is brought up through Raffaella and through Gunter. So what I want to say briefly about this is, let's start with Mussolini and some of the interesting facts about that. I mean, Mussolini had a Jewish mistress. So when fascism first started in Italy, there were many Italians that supported fascism. In fact, there were many Jewish Italians who supported fascism. And people didn't realize how it was going to turn around and bite them in the neck. And then in time, once Mussolini had his alliance with Hitler, then things started to change big time. And then we started having the racial laws that come about in Italy, and people losing jobs and so on and so forth, and it keeps going on until people are actually shipped out of Italy to the camps. So we have situations where once people were Italian who happened to be Jewish, and of course this happened all over Europe. Once people were Italian who happened to be Jewish, and then suddenly they became Jewish and no longer Italian. When there is a rich history, if you go back, I mean, we tend to think of Italy because of the Vatican, because of Rome, as, a Catholic nation, all that kind of the seat of Catholicism or whatever. But you go back far enough in Italian history, and it really is a mix of cultures. And if we look at religions and ethnicities and cultures, it's a mix of Christianity, of Muslim, of Judaism. I mean, the foods, everything. It's a real mix of all these people coming together there for various reasons. When we had the Crusades going on, many people wound up in southern Italy, and then names were changed and they assimilated into Italian cultures. But many of us who are Italian or are Southern Italian, if we really chased our roots, there's a very good chance that we will find that, in fact, our ancestors either practiced Islam or Judaism. If you go back far enough and you study. So again, with this, in Sanctuaries, it's fictionalized through the story of Raffaella and the story of Gunter, but there are truths that happened. There are truths that gay men were imprisoned in Germany, and when they opened the camps, they were sent to the camps, and when the camps were closed, they were put back in prison. It didn't end after the war was over. The story in Sanctuaries about the town where the women and the children were slaughtered and put in a church, and the whole church, and they burned the church down, that the Nazis, that comes from a true story. Again, I fictionalized it in Sanctuaries, but that's from a true story. Because what was going on now, we had the Americans coming up from the South, and we still had, at that point, Mussolini had been arrested, and then he was freed again by the Nazis. So we still have the Germans coming down from the north. And as they're coming down from the north, many of the towns are being burned and being destroyed with hopes that they were still going to conquer what was going on. So the Assisi Underground, again, I mentioned that's also factual information. So the individual people, their individual stories are fiction, but there's a lot of historic truth throughout the book, throughout the whole book. And then, of course, last night, and Jeff was kind enough to add this, when I realized that today would have been Emmett Till's 82nd birthday, I felt like that just had to be added. That just had to be added for this book and for this conversation, that we can't deny, as much as people are trying to deny and rewrite right now, we can't deny that a 14-year-old boy, that a woman lied and said that he flirted with her, and that her husband and brother or brother-in-law or whoever went and dragged him out of his uncle's house and murdered him. We can't deny that that happened. We can't deny that his courageous mother had an open casket so that the world could see how he was brutalized because of hatred and racism. So to me, it almost felt like, I don't know what, like, wow, we're talking about this today. We have to acknowledge that he would have been 82 years old today had he not been murdered, And then in closing, and again, as you know, I started the book with Desmond Tutu's quote. I mean, I didn't write this book to make it look like, oh, isn't everything terrible and we're all terrible and we have to forget it. It's all, I mean, the book really, it's about truth, but through truth then we have healing. That we are seeking healing. And again, through the stories of Gianni and Raffaella and everybody else, I hope that the sense of healing came through. But healing only happens if we acknowledge truth. You can't have a burn, you can't have a cancer and ignore it and think that if you ignore it, it's going to go away if I just put a Band-Aid over it. No, it has to be acknowledged and it has to be treated. And that's how we move forward. So with that, we'd like to invite everybody up and move into a conversation about the book, but also maybe more about some of the issues that the book brings up.
Grab cannolis on the way. Our goal as a task force is we know this is a great book for all of us that have read it. It's a great story. But I think you can acknowledge and see that the past does have a tendency to repeat itself. And in this particular case, that might not be a good thing.
I think we need more.
And we're going to ask people to use the microphone when they talk so that the people that are live streaming can hear your question or comment.
Chair here. Wait, I'll move it out of the way so you could step down. Okay? Here you go. You can sit. No, I could be anywhere. It doesn't matter. We have a circle. Okay?
I'm going to stand because I got to bring the microphone.
Most of us who are Catholic, Jesus is in the tabernacle, and there's some Catholics that think, why would we ever have Jesus in the tabernacle in the midst of this discussion? And I think that's right where Jesus would want to be.
He'd be in the circle. He would be in the.
He'd be anointing cannoli too. Not to be scandalized.
Do we need any more?
That's on the stage, just raise your hand up, I need the mic, and you can speak into
Do you,
it.
do you want it, Chairman?
Yeah,
I can grab one of these.
I'm gonna be standing, because I got to
Okay.
stand the mic.
oh, I don't, okay. Dang, this is a good crowd. Yeah. Oh, I already have.
Oh, you have it.
They already heard me say dang.
What?
Do you want to kick it off? and-
I honestly just am gonna, this story to me resonates in many, many places, and I got an education in a lot of, unfortunately, fascism history. But for me, what really stuck out as a gay man was the relationship that Gabrielle had with being a mother to so many young people that were tossed out by their families, and how that still is happening to this day. And we need more mothers like that.
And again, that was true. I mean, the character of Gabriel is not true, but that was the case and is still the case in many situations where gay youth were put out of their homes and that drag queens stepped in as surrogate parents. So again, the story of Gabriel is, the character Gabriel is fictionized, but there are many real people who did that.
A lot of people don't realize, but according to statistics just a couple years ago, the majority of homeless youth in the city of Syracuse are LGBTQ youth who have been kicked out by their families. They only make up less than 10% of the population, but they make up the majority of homeless youth. So parents are still throwing their kids out for that reason.
And unfortunately, many of those parents consider themselves religious.
Very religious.
That's right.
Very religious.
Don't be shy, please.
Just a thing that struck me with the book that I, Vince, would like you to, when I was reading it, in that era, at least in the book, it seemed to me that Gianni and Ezra and Owen and handled, at least in the book, being gay in a way that is much more in the present moment than like, especially being brought up Catholic and all of that stuff, that at least in the book it wasn't much of an issue to them, where I know myself, it was like hell going through being a Catholic and being all the stuff that not just from religion, but from culture too, that it was such a scary thing. And I didn't catch that in the book.
Mm-hmm.
There you go.
When I was reading the book, it brought up a lot of memories of sitting in front of the television set and watching old movies, but really what was happening in the news. My father was in the military during the Vietnam War, and I can remember the difficulty he was in because he was a social worker, and to talk with the soldiers coming back from the war, and it was a painful time. We would go on Sundays and watch medals being awarded posthumously to soldiers, and so a lot of that came back when I was reading the book, and also the pictures of the civil rights movement and the sense of fear going on. And I think that's happening today when, I've kind of stopped watching the news because I would get so wound up, hearing all the stories of racism and all these anti-trans bills, and you know, just all this stuff, and that brought it up, but to bring it to the ending, you know, there was a sense of hope. So I think we need to hold on to hope in the midst of all this anxiety-producing times.
Very good.
I noticed too, like you said, Father Fred, that there wasn't as much angst as I would have expected at that time. However, I also, they did not talk about it either. I mean, all of these men very much kept it to themselves, even with their friends until later on, when they felt safer, I guess, with their friends. But I did also really like the relationships with, I mean, he had parents who seemed to be very sort of typical old world Italian kinds, but they also were very, I mean, they were very loving parents. I just appreciated that. There were many difficult relationships portrayed, but people stuck with it. I mean, the one between Raffaella and her husband, you know, they didn't agree on a lot of things, but they stuck it out. And the parents with their kids and so on, and kids with their parents. I like that part.
I think for all the terrible, historical, all those things that you've mentioned and gone through, which are very essential to the book, what stuck with me the most was the relationships, like you were saying, the love and the kindness and the simplicity of the relationships with Gianni and Raffaella and Gunther and Gabriel, and how everyone just cared for each other and took care of each other. And maybe they didn't talk about it, maybe they didn't ask questions, but they did what was right, and they did so without question. And they did it every day. They did it when it was hard. They did what needed to be done, because that's what you do for people. Right. And that's the message of hope, I think, that's in there, despite everything that was going on in the world and everything that was going on in everyone's lives. That's what stuck with me. So even though it could be a super depressing book, I didn't find it to be depressing. In the end, I found it to be wonderful and hopeful and inspiring. If people could have that history and live those lives and still be good and love people, then maybe we can do that now too. Maybe we can all be like that.
I will say I totally agree with the parent aspect. I grew up in a home with parents like that. Unfortunately, we didn't talk about a lot of stuff though, and that led me out on my own. But I grew up on the southwest side of the city of Syracuse at a time when race was a serious issue. But in my house, that it was not acceptable to be part of a movement that was discriminating against anyone. So I did recognize that in the parents.
Go ahead.
Once people read the book, it becomes theirs. So I'm intentionally, I mean, if I'm just kind of sitting back, but in that situation, in Gianni's situation in a city like New York City, what you did see that you might not have seen in smaller towns or smaller cities or whatever, were these dual lives. So you had the life in your neighborhood where you lived one way and you didn't talk about it and this, that, and the other happened. And then you got on the train and you had a whole other life. You had a whole other life, those lives. But it was also the life in the closet. Not only was it the life in the closet, but it was also very dangerous, because when you got on the train, and I speak about this a little bit in the book, there are many people who didn't survive it. Many people who didn't. I mean, I'm not even sure what the expression means, but, but for the grace of God, that expression, that. But, if I look at my own history, it's quite remarkable that I'm actually here today. It really is quite remarkable that I'm actually here today, that somehow something didn't happen within that other life that was the life that you kind of didn't talk about. You didn't talk about. And then eventually had to somehow make peace with, when you got older. Unfortunately, some people stayed that way. And those are, I hate to see that, but I think we all know people who, wound up, well, you were going to say something.
Yeah, we're doing that for people at home.
So I kept, as a mother, I kept waiting for something to happen to Gianni. That, it was like, oh no, like he was definitely putting himself in some risky situations, and I was like, oh, what's going to happen to him? Like, I was so concerned about that, and it, got to the end of the book and thought, oh. And with you saying that right now, so was it intentional that there was no moment when he, had,
Well, I think in the character Gianni, he wound up, he was fortunate. He wound up finding sanctuaries, right? I mean, that's really what it's about. And maybe, in this book, a lot of it is around LGBT issues, but that's not the whole thing. But, he found sanctuaries not just in places, but in people. And then very clearly in the beginning of the book, what was not a sanctuary for him early on was the church, around LGBT issues, around issues of race, around, the early church's experience with that. He pulled away from it. But in his friendship with Rafaela, in his coming upon Gabriel in the bar, so there were people and places that were sanctuaries where he wound up working. So it kind of got him through that difficult time where he left school, where this happened and that happened. So I guess we could say that Gianni was quite fortunate, right? He was quite fortunate. Even his friendship with Owen, that turned into something else. I mean, that could have backfired where Owen could have been somebody that just, So he lucked out in many ways.
I was going to add that I can really relate to the idea that Vince brought up about leading a double life, because luckily I'm a Gemini, so it was easier for me. But when Stonewall happened, I was a 23-year-old second-year teacher living in a small city, Auburn, New York, where everybody knows everybody. And I literally fled to Syracuse on the weekends to the bars because that was the only place I could be myself. And I ended up having to lie to my parents, my family, my friends, my colleagues of what I did on the weekends, because I was petrified that if anybody found out, I would lose my job. And I would have, because we were all considered pedophiles then. People forget that at that point in time, before Stonewall and right after Stonewall, the American Psychiatric Association still considered it a mental illness to be LGBTQ. People lost their jobs, they got thrown out of their homes, their apartments, so it was a tough time. And like Gianni, I don't think he ever really had a conversation with his parents. They kind of alluded to it.
His mother alluded at what, yeah.
But that's my greatest regret in my life, that both my parents went to their graves without us ever talking about it. I know they knew, and I found out later through other relatives that they talked about it, but I never felt safe because the fear was always there that I'd be one of those homeless kids on the street, because I came from a very Catholic family, 12 years of Catholic school, and it was very, very difficult, to the point that eventually when I was in college and was in confession, my confessor said, if you can't stop being that way, don't come back again. So for 25 years, I didn't go to church until I found an LGBT Catholic group here. So it was a tough time. It was a tough time.
Somebody over here somewhere.
thought that at the end of the book, Johnny was growing into being a sanctuary, and that through Gabriel he was learning, he had learned and was continuing to learn from Gabriel's example, and had hung the sign in his window, and that youth had looked up at the sign, and he was growing into being a sanctuary. I did think about, as reading the book, that Phoenix kept offering to him the line that you can't make other people's choices for them. But he kept making that choice for her by not talking to her about his situation. He didn't give her the chance to have the conversation with him, because she brought it up.
With his mother, yeah.
She brought up that there were all kinds of people in her home, in her background, with her dad's, whatever that business or whatever.
Yeah, she was a red diaper baby, which
Right,
meant
she
that
gave
her
the
parents were
yeah, she was a
communists.
red diaper baby.
Right.
So she gave the opportunity to talk about it, but he didn't want to. So he made the choice not to talk with her about it. And she gave opportunities. Don't make other people's choices for them. The other thing that I wanted to mention about current times and the times in this book, it's so disturbing, the growing fascism in today's world with Netanyahu and his growing fascist regime, and the fascist flavor in some of American politics, and how fascism slowly but surely snuck up on European governments, and nobody did anything about it in 1930s and until it was too late.
Exactly.
And yes, and that we can't wait until it's too late.
Right. And that's what we have to, we're always living in history.
Right.
And what we have to recognize is that Mussolini didn't just appear. You know, these were elections, these are people.
Yes.
Hitler just didn't appear.
Right.
You know, and again, like I said, how things, sometimes you create something that then even gets away from you. I mean, as I said, Mussolini had a Jewish girlfriend.
Right.
You know, and all of a sudden now he's like, you know, he's putting people on trains and sending them off to camps. If we look at Nazi Germany, in the beginning of Nazi Germany, we see gay men who were involved in some of the Nazi organizations. And that certainly turned around and bit gay men on the ass. Right. If we look at early fascism in Italy, we see Jews who were involved in fascism. And that certainly turned. So this is what I mean by that. We're always living in history. And I think many times, sometimes people get involved, they say, oh, well, it's not going to touch me. It's not going to touch me. It's not. Right. But it then grows into something right. that goes beyond. And I agree. I mean, I think Netanyahu, if we look at some of the things happening in this country, if we look at Hungary, you know, we do see a global trend toward dictator kinds of wannabes. And we have to acknowledge that. This is why my feeling about, I mean, that was part of my intent. Yes, Gianni was gay, you know, but there are many other issues in it. My intent was really holding up a mirror to this was truth back then, but you know what? Not too far from the truth today, too. We're on that path.
So why didn't you have him come out to his mother in the book? Why didn't he pick up that opportunity to talk with her about it, to talk with Pina?
I guess he didn't want to. I guess he didn't tell me to. Do you know what I mean? And, you know, my writing, I'm very character-driven, and I get a sense of the characters. I have some sense of story, but I really get a sense of the characters, and then the characters start telling me their story.
So do you think it was fear? Still fear? He had fear?
I think he just. I think maybe he wasn't ready to merge the worlds. Do you know what I mean? He wasn't quite ready to merge those two worlds. He was living in two worlds, and it started to overlap a little bit. You know, I think with Rafaela, he acknowledged it. You know, there were some ways that it started to overlap, but I don't know that he was quite. I mean, then, you know, a question that I'd love to ask readers is, you know, so what's the sequel? Do you know what I mean? Does he come out to Fina? Does he, how about the guy that looks up at the Sanctuary signs? Does something happen there? Do he and Owen really, you know what I mean? And the sequel is for you to write. I'm not writing it. Yeah.
I was looking forward to the next movie.
I just wanted to make one comment. I have a nephew who 20 years ago, when he was 16, came out. His father was he worked for the Diocese of Buffalo, and he was the money guy. So it was a very difficult come out. And at that time, I flew to Buffalo on the highway, and my words to him were only, I just don't want anybody to hurt you. Right. My son came out to me a month ago as being non-binary, and he's 38. And it broke my heart that I had to say the same words.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
That I had to say the same words 20 years later.
Oh, yeah.
I just don't want anyone to hurt you.
That you're fearful. Yep.
And that what you're saying about we're reliving history so resonates. I hope there's nobody else who has that same fear.
Okay.
I'd just like to respond to the first part of your question. Being a gay man reading the book, if he had come out to his mother, I would have thought it was unrealistic.
You would have what?
I would have thought it was unrealistic, because for me and everybody I knew, all my friends, the fear of rejection was so great that you didn't dare tell anybody that you cared about, because as much as you knew your parents loved you, you saw what happened around you, and that fear is always there of telling people.
Right. It was
not
1972.
so much today. I mean, at my age now, I don't care.
Yeah.
But for a young person, it's still difficult. It's still difficult.
Dang. Right.
People talking about why he didn't come out to his parents, I had the sense that he was more upset about being adopted, that was his main angst. He knew how he wanted to live. He knew where to go to find friends that he wanted to be with. But this adoption thing really, to me, really ate at him. And his parents didn't have any good words for him about that. So why would he go to his parents about being gay? You know, they didn't comfort him with that. They ignored it for a long time. That was my sense of the book. That's what I got out of it, was the whole adoption thing was kind of the groundwork.
Good point.
That's very good.
Good point.
Yeah, I agree with you about the adoption thing, because I have 2 adopted kids, and we have a lot of issues. But he does, in one part of the book, say something about he was so good at the bakery, and someone said, "Oh, you got that from your parents," and he said, "No, I'm adopted." And then they said, "Well,
Marion, could you repeat?
The best
I
apple
can't-
trees are the ones that are grafted."
Oh.
And then I think he kind of felt, yeah, it's not so bad being adopted. I did get a lot of good things from my parents. So maybe after that, he might have felt more comfortable. But I felt the same thing about adoption.
See, this is what I mean by a book becoming the reader's. I love that. Like, I love that you know what I mean? Like, that's what was jumping out to you, and something else jumped out.
The adoption part I thought was very realistic for that time, you know, how it was handled by not being handled and whatever, which I think we've come a long ways today in Minnie's situation. But maybe I've just read the book with rose-colored glasses, but I had a real sense with couple of instances, that Gianni knew that his mother knew, and that she loved him anyway, and she hugged him, and so that I don't know if there was a necessary need for words. They both knew that she knew he was gay, and he knew she was, and she hugged him. So back in 1972, that was pretty good, I would think. You know.
My take on the adoption thing was that he was upset because they had never told him, and when his aunt and his cousins threw it in his face, that's what really upset him, not so much that he was adopted, but who had
The gentleman over there.
Bill?
I want to talk not so much about the content, if you will, but more about the form. And when you say that characters speak to you, that was so obvious to me. That was your characters were so well developed that I hurt when I read about Gabriel.
Yep.
I mean, I said it out loud. I said something. I don't know what I said, but I said
hurt when you read what?
about Gabriel.
Gabriel.
About yeah. I just didn't want to say that in case it was a spoiler alert. You know what I mean? But sure, go ahead, tell him. Yeah, right. But anyway, I just think that even the minor characters, I could see what they look like, you know. And I just thought you did a remarkable job. What I have to ask you about, though, and I feel that, you know, like when you say, hey, I've been to that bar and this kind of stuff, what do you know about birthing a calf? Where in your background did you come up with that?
I've lived a very complicated life. You know?
Clearly.
Vince, keep talking because we got to put new batteries in this.
Vince, I got a question for you, Vince. We were talking about what's going on in Israel right now, and you talk about Raphael and God. The relationship between the Jewish people and the gay men at that time in World War II. What I noticed during the protests over the past several days is among all those flags of Israel flew pride flags.
Yes.
Did some relationship come out of that? Because they're also very open people and accepting people. I don't know where your research got you.
That's complicated. Yeah, I mean, Israel is let's put it this way, in many, many ways, Israel is a very progressive country in many ways. Just like America is a very progressive, parts of America are a very progressive country in many ways. And there are many things that are very problematic about America, just like there are many things that are very problematic about Israel. But yes, as far as being in the Middle East, the view of LGBTQ people is certainly much better than the surrounding country.
Just wondering if
The
some
surrounding countries.
relationship.
I don't think that it comes out of something historic. I think it comes out of it comes out of an educated people. It comes out of a somewhat progressive nation in many ways. Not in all ways. There are certainly problems that we see in Israel right now, just like in America and a lot of other places. But that does get confusing sometimes because we wind up thinking, oh, well, look, this country has this view of LGBTQ people. Isn't that wonderful? Yes, but then we also look at the Palestinian situation.
Yeah, true.
And that's another whole.
I can share from personal experience because my husband is from Israel, and when he was first here and we were fighting to find a way for him to stay in the country, my government, we didn't have gay marriage yet, and I was not allowed to sponsor him as my same-sex partner for a green card. But we could have left and gone to Israel at that time, and he could have sponsored me as his same-sex partner in Israel, a very religious country, supposedly, and yet here in the United States, it wasn't possible. So there's a very active LGBTQ population in Israel. In fact, one of the biggest pride events is in Tel Aviv every year. Biggest events in the whole world is in Tel Aviv, Israel, every year.
Kind of just bringing it back to this country. I have a grandchild who is living in Florida, and she's up visiting for the summer. Actually, we're kind of discussing maybe you'd like to stay here. She is aware that she's not going to get the correct history of most anything, and she's trying to find herself on top of it. So it's a fear. It's a fear for her safety and for her education, and how many people are going to be uneducated and gullible because they have no mechanism of knowing anything different. It's very frightening, and it's our country. That's what's hard to imagine, that she can live in Florida, we can live up here, and there are two different worlds. So, yeah.
Just as a point of reference, I just want everybody to realize it's not perfect here either. I had two friends that told me after the Supreme Court decision a few weeks ago on the LGBTQ issue, one person went to a repair shop, car repair shop here in town, and there was a sign posted on the door that said, "Guns allowed here, gays and trans beware." And someone else was in one of the shopping malls and walked past a hairstylist shop, and the sign in the window said, "We do not serve trans people." So those kinds of issues exist right here in New York State. We don't want to think that we're perfect. We're better than Florida, but we're not perfect.
Imagine being a young person today and constantly,
Somebody in the last few days showed us a photo taken in front of the Swan Pond in Manlius, and there was a man standing there. Was it white nationalism, or I'm a white nationalist, or white supremacy? Yeah, yeah. In Manlius, right in the middle of the day, with a mask over his face. Yeah, yeah. He had a mask so that people would know him.
I just wanted to share a couple things. I mentioned earlier that my father was in the military, and when I was a young teenager, we moved to Germany. And when we were in Germany, my father, who fought in World War II in the Pacific, he was always a good historian, loved history, and I think I went to every military cemetery there was in Europe. But they took me to Dachau prison camp, and I will never, ever forget that experience of going there as a 13-year-old and walking through there and seeing the pictures, and it just really, really affected me. From that point on, I did a lot of historical work, reading and everything as a young teen, all about the question, what happened there. And this was in like 1971, or 1972. And when you walked in there, you could still smell the death. It was just such a profound experience. And in the book, after when Gunther dies, and he mentions the quote by Martin Niemöller. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I'm not a socialist. Then I came for the trade unionist, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then I came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then I came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. I thought that was just so, so profound. And, there was a woman who worked for, actually she worked for American School, and I would be waiting for the school bus to, to come pick me up. And we'd have a conversation, and I happened to mention Hitler one time. And she said to me, she was in middle age, and she lived through, the war and everything, and she said to me, well, he wasn't all that bad. After all, he built the Autobahns. Yeah, I know. So, and that's what made me, so I thought, there's still that idea that, well, it's not doesn't affect me, so therefore, let's just forget about it. So I think today we need to think about that too. Who do we need to protect and help?
In writing this book, there were certainly some parts that I had to do more research than others, birthing a calf, being one of them. But, and a friend of mine, and I mention it in the acknowledgments, a friend of mine lent me her mom's personal memoir that she wrote for the family. And she was in the camps. And I knew this woman. I knew her in her later years. By the time I met her, she was already about 80. She, maybe lived a few years after I met her. And she's since passed. But to read what she wrote, first of all, I just kept it in the house for about 2 weeks. I couldn't read it. And I must have picked it up about 3 or 4 times, and I just wasn't able to do it. And then finally, I got myself to read through it. Like you could know something, but then it hits another level. Do you know what I mean? There are different ways, that something just hits another level.
It's important to know that the people that are trying to rewrite African American history also want the Holocaust to be taught the same way, that the teacher's supposed to tell the good things about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust. What possibly could be good is beyond me, but that's the direction we're heading to. And the rationale for all this makes me so angry as a teacher. The rationale is that they don't want the white kids to feel uncomfortable. Well, if a teacher's doing their job, they're not going to make those kids feel the blame for that, but you want them to feel some empathy for what happened. And that's the problem.
Or you just want them to know truth. This woman here.
Talking about the Holocaust, when Gianni, who has this relationship with Raffaella, when he first sees the numbers on her arm, I just really identified with that because I remember as an 11-year-old, I had this algebra teacher who was Jewish, and she was just a very good teacher and somebody I looked up to. And it was spring, and she wore a scoop neck, and she bent over to help somebody, and she had the numbers on her chest, and it just hit home that this, somebody that I cared about had been in a camp, and she had never spoken about it. I mean, we were 11 years old. She wasn't going to be talking about that. But, and then I think there's people today who are still denying that it ever happened. I mean, we still have living proof. These people still have these numbers on them. And then I think, in a few years, all those people will have died out, and there won't be the living proof anymore. So it's just scary. And I just want to say, what hit me in the book, and I identified with place so much, because my Italian grandparents lived in Queens, and I grew up on Long Island, so I knew all these places that Vince was talking about. So everything was very real. Place was real. But the characters, and then, what made this story so real was their sexuality didn't make any difference. Raffaella was a really good person. Gabrielle was a really good, caring person. Gianni was a caring person. They had these real caring relationships, and their sexuality didn't make you a good person or a bad person. So,
was there anybody you didn't like? There had to be someone you didn't like. I said, was there anyone you didn't like?
The aunt. She was terrible.
Okay, there you go. All right.
Yeah.
Good, good.
Over here.
Over here.
Over here, Bill.
Coming from a different culture, I grew up in a place where didn't know anything about it.
You can get closer to the mic.
Okay.
Thank you.
Didn't know anything about it. Indeed, there was no word for it. Indeed, the first time I had anything was reading. I won a scholarship, not a scholarship, a subscription to Time magazine. And so the thing would come to my village every week, and I would read it cover to cover, including the ads. There was nothing else to do, so. And then I was reading about a long coverage of the assassination of Harvey Milk.
Who?
Harvey Milk.
Harvey Milk, yeah.
In San Francisco. And they talked about the mayor, the school board, and at that time we had school board. It's kind of like a boring thing. And I'm wondering, and they said this man was gay. I didn't know what gay was, or at least what it was in the text. The gay I know is a happy person. So I picked out my dictionary and looked, and all he had was a happy person.
We're very happy people.
So I went to, the Reverend gentleman who is my teacher at the time. And of course, he picked up his own dictionary, which was same as mine. And all the definition he had was a happy person. But the entire series of articles never explained what gay was. It never did. And as I read it, it just looked to me like there was something else. But being in this village, this was it. The world ended from here. This is it. Until many years later, that's when I was already in college, studying to be a teacher, when suddenly I learned what it was. And then all of those things I read then kind of made sense. I say kind of because when they told the life history of Mr. Milk, he was a good person. Then I was wondering, why would somebody be so angry at him to want him dead? To want him dead. The only explanation we could come, and I apologize for it, was that this is America. Everybody has a gun. And they shoot people for fun. You might wonder, why did I end up here? Like they simply shoot people for fun. And Time magazine was full of examples of it. It didn't say that was what happened, but it was simply in Chicago, in New York. It was mayhem. This is in the 1970s. And then, I'm ordinarily an inquisitive person. So I started trying to find information about different sexuality. And of course, there was a lot. It's just that it wasn't easily available. It wasn't, you can't just go and get it. You kind of have to go and Yankee, kind of like. And I did that. So that helped me understand the culture. So that when I then came to this country, I started realizing, as a black person, I meet people for the first time, and they have already drawn conclusions about me. And that gave me insight into what the gay people were going through. And this is very unfair. And then at that time I go to church, and they preach hatred of gays. About how all of those kind of things. So being a black person, I said, no. What people are going through and what I am going through is the same thing. I am not gay, but I'm black. They are gay, and so that is the problem I was facing, it's simply because I'm a black person, therefore I have to be a crooked person, I have to be a drug dealer, I have to, in other words, all of the terrible things that could, that is, you have to watch your wallet, otherwise I'm. And then on the gay side, they come up with a series of things. And my thing, now I know a lot more about the boat, is where do we go from here? My kids, we have taught them to be very comfortable with everybody they meet. We teach them in our house to be. Indeed, one of the things that.
Doing a good job too with that, I'll tell you.
Okay, thank you for that. But the water is here. We're about to drown. Okay, we're trying. We teach them that. But sometimes, you see, we feel like we are not doing enough. So where do we go from here? Because what I have seen in the last several years is that it looked like the clock was going backwards. That things were, instead of going forward, is now going backwards. Being gay is becoming more dangerous, thanks to many of our politicians and our leaders, both religious and civil. What do we do to see to it that that doesn't continue? That, like you said, the story from 20 years ago is the story now, and then 20 years from now is very, very demoralizing. Especially for me, coming from somebody who is not gay, who didn't know about it until. But now I cannot claim ignorance anymore. So where do we go from here? I haven't finished the book, I have read quite a bit of it. I'm not Italian, so there is a lot of things that I don't get. But the sexual, that is the orientation, the sexual orientation part, I get very well. So what do we do? I come as a straight person because I do think that, you see, that in this group, we should have more straight people here. Not just people who have relationships with gay people, friends, brothers and sisters. So where do we go from here? So that, even when I taught in college, I bring it up in class and we discuss it. And I thought I helped my students. But then now, during the last election, I drive towards the North Country, and it just looked like nothing had changed.
Well, I think the book begs that question of where do we go from here in a lot of issues, not just LGBT issues, but issues of race, issues of anti-Semitism, all of those issues. So what do we do now with the backlash that we're seeing? Yes. And we all have to play a role in our small communities and the way our communities overlap. Because even if we look at this particular story, like when I told the story of Stonewall, one of the problems when Stonewall gets told over and over again, even in a movie that was made recently, is that it gets very whitewashed. And in fact, Stonewall, as I mentioned earlier, wasn't just about who you're attracted to or your identity, your gender identity. It was also about race. It was also about class. And many of the people that were part of that were in fact people of color, people who were trans. I mean, even within the gay community, there's conflicts between, gay men and lesbian and people who are trans and this, that, and the other thing. And yeah, we could all keep fighting each other. And then the powers to be love that. We could all keep going against each other. And, so.
A lot of that changed with AIDS, too. It forced us to come together as groups. Yes. You're right.
Well, I have, up until maybe yesterday, I've thought that there's, the political solution is the way to go. I mean, we all have a vote. We can, make sure that we know who we're voting for and so on. But it's just occurring to me that that may not be an answer because the way politics is going right now, a party comes in and undoes everything that that the last president or the last leaders did. And looking ahead, we got gay marriage, legalized and civil rights and all of these things, and now these things are being undone. And it looks as though the political parties are setting themselves up to, as soon as the party changes of the Congress or White House or whatever, then they undo everything that their predecessors had done. And it seems like it's being set up so that that's an easier kind of process. And I find that very discouraging and frightening because how will we make progress if people could come along and undo it all?
I can give you two suggestions. First and foremost, which is the easiest one to do, but it is very difficult for many people, is when you hear someone say something that that's making you uncomfortable, don't walk away from the situation. Say something. You want to defeat the politician and the crap that's going on there? Do that with your pocketbook. There's many places you can go online to find out where companies stand and see what happened to Budweiser, but I don't drink Bud, so. But your purse, your wallet, that unfortunately in this country is where it matters. That's why we're capitalists.
Yeah. But don't patronize companies that are anti-gay, for one thing. I wanted to clarify something, too. As a group, I don't have the same civil rights that you do. In New York State, I do, because New York State has a gay civil rights law. In 30 states in this country, it is still legal to fire someone from their job for being LGBTQ. It's legal to throw them out of their apartment. The big joke when gay marriage was passed was that you could get married on Saturday and lose your job on Monday. So we don't have equal rights. Like a lot of people thought when gay marriage came along, everything was solved. We do not have those equal rights. Okay, so that's real important for people to know, yeah.
Is the Equal Rights Amendment still has not passed?
No.
No. Well, our congressman probably knows my name by now. I'm constantly writing to our congressman. I wrote to him about about immigrants, about immigration, about but I'm Episcopalian, and I belong to a group that's Episcopal policy, and we as a group fight for immigration reforms and on and on and on. So I usually get an answer back from Chuck Schumer usually writes me back. Our congressman writes me back. But a few weeks ago, granted he has been in the hospital, had a bypass, but I wrote to him about transgender health care and the need for transgender health care. And I told him my story and how before I received that gender affirming care, I was suicidal. I was not able to function, and how that has completely changed my whole life. And I haven't received a letter back when I constantly get letters back about other issues, but that one I haven't received the answer yet. Maybe he will yet, because he's just out of the hospital. But yeah, given that. But
But I think we have to feel also, I mean, just look at what we're doing here. We're in a Catholic church and we read this book and we're talking about this. I mean, that's pretty remarkable. So we have to feel good about where there is resistance, there are things that are going on. I mean, also, there's tremendous resistance to the latest thing from the state school board in Florida about trying to point out the good things about slavery, where people benefited. So there are professors, there are teachers' unions that are fighting against that. You talk about trans issues. I mean, right now, the National Organization for Trans Health or something, my son is trans. And he was just invited to sing down, and they're going to the belly of the beast. They're going to Orlando, Florida. And there is a trans marathon runner who is running cross country this weekend, will arrive in Orlando, Florida. And he's running cross country to promote the idea of more need for trans health and trans people in sports, more visibility. When he arrives in Florida, they're going to have a 5K fundraiser for this organization. And my son is going to sing there. He's a performer, he's singing. So there's resistance. There's stuff going on. I mean, I don't want any of us to leave here feeling like we have to go home and lock the door. That's the last thing we want to do.
But you should lock your door.
Yes. I just want to respond to two things my friend here brought up. The big change, the big difference I see between Stonewall time and today is that most gay people have come out of the closet. And once people know someone who is gay, and it's someone they like and respect and care about, it's very hard to believe all those stereotypes that you talked about. So that was the big thing. The other thing I wanted to say, on a note of hope, I still, at my age of 78, still substitute teach. And I work in junior high school all the time. And for the last 4 or 5 years, I have not heard kids call each other faggots anymore. I have not heard kids use the phrase, "that's so gay." Those things are gone. Kids in junior high are coming out now, and the other kids are accepting them. So I think our hope lies with the younger generation, not their parents and people my age. Mary, it's your turn.
My brother has been discussing with me a book he's been listening to about Lincoln and a biography of Lincoln. And he said, Mary, nothing has changed. It is all the same situation in a different color, in a different form. And it's hard to believe that we haven't moved forward further. But I just have such tremendous hope because of people like you. of people who gather and share and care. And the question is, where do we go from here?
Just a quick thing that was striking me when Vince was mentioning about who'd ever think in 1972 when this book was written that over 30 people would be sitting in a Roman Catholic sanctuary reflecting on this issue, let alone, the book. And I think all of us have to work at not getting discouraged, because there has been a lot of change if we look back. And what's going on in this country, that's where we have to continue to find our voices and speak. By and large, that far right wing in the Catholic Church and in the society as a whole is a small, tiny group of people that are well-funded, well-backed by powerful people or whatever. But you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And so I think it's so important that we find our voices and continue to speak up and not let the small minority to do any more harm.
Yep.
They're powerful because they're loud.
And they're rich, a lot of them.
And they're rich.
They're backed by big money people.
There's money behind it. There's money
But
behind
I just wonder, our bishop, he mentions, and I've talked to others, that Sean Michael Winters, who was in Syracuse, a reporter for the NCR, who's all over the world or whatever, and he points out that the right-wing Catholic Church people are on the phone, emailing, texting the bishops day in and day out, day after day. And the more progressive Catholics, which are statistics show, far more the majority of Catholics, the bishops very rarely hear from. So that's one of the problems. Right. That's church, but it's also with politics too. They need to hear, like Kevin was saying, Colin, we need to let them know that this isn't where our country as a whole is at. Silence is consenting to the
exactly.
I always tell LGBTQ youth that I talk with today that as tough as it seems for them, they have it 100 times easier than Fred and Vince and I had back in the 60s and 70s. And I just want to share one little story with you, and then I'll turn the mic over. But it's funny, but it also shows you the paranoia of that time. This was around 1968, 69. It was still against the law to be caught having some homosexual sex in New York State. And I was riding around I had a new convertible, and my high school friend who had just left the seminary, we were out for a ride, and we're riding through Skinny Atlas, if you know little Skinny Atlas. And he said to me, Bill, he said, I have something to tell you. And he said, I hope it's not going to affect our friendship. And I said, okay, Michael, what is it? He said, I'm gay. And I looked at him with a big smile on my face, because this was the first time I'd really talked to someone. I said, so am I. Immediately, a state trooper pulled us over with the sirens blasting and the lights flashing. We looked at each other and said, oh my God, he heard us, we're going to be arrested. Luckily, somebody had robbed a gas station with a car like mine. But that shows you the paranoia that you faced at the time. Someone else, yes.
So I know you said that most people have come out of the closet. Well, we have friends. Now, granted, 2 of them do live in Texas. We won't hold it against them. They rather lie than admit that they are gay. They have been together 30-some years. They would rather lie. We have other friends. Their families probably all know, but they don't talk about it. So one thing I would say is, in our own families, I think it would be really helpful. Like, all of my children know our relationship. My grandkids do. So at least my grandkids, then they talk about, all kinds of things, and they're not afraid to. One time my daughter was little, and granddaughter was little, and she said, well, maybe I'd rather marry a woman than a man. And but if people still aren't out and their families don't know, then it makes it really hard.
My partner had an aunt. My partner passed away about 9 years ago. We were together 39 years. And he had an aunt who was a lesbian, and she was a partner, and the family knew it, and we all knew it. And she never came out. She never talked about it. And in fact, in my collection of short stories, one of the stories is inspired by her experience. And once she knew Jack and I were together. She knew we had a child, but she never, and we never said anything, we didn't force her out. And then when she passed, we had her ashes actually sitting in the basement for about 5 years before we took a boat over to Nantucket, where she and her partner shared a place for years, and we got to meet her community there. And she had this whole other wonderful life, but she never merged the two lives. It's not that she was closeted in the sense of that she didn't live her life, but she maintained these two lives. There was the life she had with the family, and then during the summer when she went to Nantucket, there was a series of women. Some of them were more out than others. Mr. Rogers was her neighbor in Nantucket. There's a wonderful story about this woman, Madaket Millie, who now there's a restaurant out there. Her father had gotten her a mail-order husband who ran off about a week after he married her. And there's all these stories about her killing a shark with a pitchfork and everything else. So it's this great restaurant. And there was this whole community. There was some straight folks, some lesbians, some were out, some weren't. And they had this rich life, but she never shared it. She never talked about it. Everybody knew, but she never talked about it.
It's people from my generation still have a hard time, I think. I mentioned that I never talked to my parents about it. My mother never knew that her brother was gay. And I only found out because a friend of mine ran into him in Provincetown. And he spent his winters in Florida and was totally out and open. When he came to home in Rochester, he was as straight could be. And once he knew that I was gay, we had a nice, close relationship. But my mother never knew. And it's sad because she didn't know the real person. She didn't know the real person. But the youth, I don't worry about. They'll tell everybody and anybody. They don't care.
I'm just wondering if we want to set it's 8:25, and I know sometimes people just want to get a feel for. So if we want to say 8:30 or something like that, and while you're talking, I'm going to step back here. Are people okay if I take a picture? Yeah. Everybody's okay. All right.
Why don't you let me take the picture while you're in it?
I just want to
All right, I'll take one
respond
of the
to
whole
the
group, and
whole
then you could go
idea
from the other
of
side.
coming out and why it's uncomfortable for some people and why it's not for others. And the bottom line is that it's whoever is the gay person, it's their choice.
Right.
And because we're human beings first, this is what I always say, we're human beings first. And whether we come out to a community or whether we don't come out to a community, it's really our choice. And if it makes other people uncomfortable that we're living our lives the way we feel we want to, then I'm sorry. I think it's important for people to be in a place of comfort for themselves, not for other people. And the other thing, Vince, I want to say about your book, get back to that, and I've been thinking about this whole conversation and how the time that you chose to write this book was so rich. You brought it up in your PowerPoint in the beginning, but so rich in I don't even know the word, but controversy, confusion, love, all of these things. It was such a time, and what a genius move to put it in that time, really, so that you could address all of those things. Because when I was first thinking about, I once heard somebody say, you don't have to put all of your good ideas into one thing, right? And I fight that too, because I got all these great ideas and I want to put them all into something, right? So I think it was a genius move to pick that time period, because you could put so many really interesting concepts and lifestyles and questions and relationships all into one spot and have it come out as a really thought-provoking and entertaining story.
So, thank you.
The relationship that bothered me the most was his relationship with his friend that married the girl. And he was, you know, I knew too many people that did that and lived a lie and ended up leaving the wife later on and with kids, and it created a whole mess.
Right.
Not living your truth.
Right.
No, I know, but not admitting, or not, well, he knew, that kid knew at that point that if he was having sex with Gianni, he knew. And
A very close friend of mine is bisexual and was in a relationship with a man for 15 years, was faithful to that person. They went their own ways, and he's been married to a woman for 25 years and has been very faithful in that relationship. So, sort of getting back to what you were saying, you know, every person is in their own reality, and we all need to respect that reality, whatever it is, even if it doesn't maybe fit our reality. Does that make sense?
Yep.
We're all individuals.
And what's behind all of this, whether we're saying gay, straight, bi, or whatever, is the whole issue of sex. And that's kind of the thing that seems to be the big problem. We wanted to, I mean, you could look at a lot of things in churches, temples and synagogues, everything else. It's controlling people around sex. Whether it's women, controlling women around sex, whether it's same-sex relationships, or whether it's even the idea of the possibility that there really could be a love between these two men and this man with this woman and his children. And it could be the love that doesn't make sense. You know, it doesn't make sense according to our, I mean, you know, I don't know. But I want to, when we're talking about coming out kinds of